Hi everyone, welcome. My name is Samantha Shokin. I manage public programs at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust in New York City. I'd like to welcome you all to today's discussion of the film Children of the Inquisition, which follows a diverse group of descendants of the Spanish and Portuguese Inquisitions as they unravel their complex and often hidden Jewish identities. We're joined today by the film's creator, Joseph Lovett. Joe is an award-winning filmmaker who produced the first investigations on AIDS for ABC's 2020. As an independent producer and director, he has created a variety of feature documentaries and over 35 hours of primetime specials. Joe has been honored with the Peabody, the AIDS Leadership, the Christopher, the Kitty Carlisle Hart, and numerous other awards from advocacy organizations, including an Emmy nomination. His last film, Going Blind, Coming Out of the Dark About Vision Loss, and its outreach campaign, Going Blind and Going Forward, have ignited a global movement of individuals, grassroots organizations, and medical professionals sponsoring screenings that raise awareness and improve access to vision enhancement services. His recently completed film, Children of the Inquisition, premiered at the Seattle Jewish Film Festival in March of last year. So welcome, Joe. I'll turn it over to you in just a minute, but before I do that, I'd like to remind all of our viewers for today that the program is being recorded and will be available for viewing later on YouTube later this week. We will also have time for audience Q&A at the end of the program. And if you'd like to participate in that, feel free to submit your questions into the chat box. Finally, before we begin, I'd like to thank our partners, the American Sephardi Federation, for their support of this event. Special thanks to Jason Guberman for his help facilitating and for joining our panel today. And now, without further ado, Joe will introduce the rest of our esteemed speakers.
Thank you so much, Samantha. We're really thrilled to be here at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, and appreciate the opportunity to be speaking to such a large audience. Can everybody hear me? I just sort of...
Yep.
Yep, okay, great. All right. So we have a lot of people to fit into a rather short amount of time, not too short. So I'd like to start by introducing our panel. First, for Professor David Gitlitz, my buddy, without whom this film would have been even more difficult to make. David has concentrated his studies on literature and culture, and while his early writings centered on Spanish Golden Age literature, he's focused on the anthropological aspects of literature and culture, especially Jewish Catholic relations in the Iberian world around the time of the expulsion of the Jews from Spain. His book, Secrecy and Deceit, The Religion of the Crypto-Jews, and A Drizzle of Honey, another book, have both won the National Jewish Book Award. His latest book, Living in Silverado's Secret Jews in the Silver Mining Towns of Colonial Mexico, profiles the earliest practicing crypto-Jewish family in Mexico from 1534. The book was a finalist for the National Jewish Book Award. David now lives in a village in the Mexican state of Oaxaca. And David was absolutely invaluable for making the film happen. We're going to start with the stars of the show. So the next person, Doreen Carbajal, who, when I first read about her book, The Forgetting River, I thought, oh my God, she has to be in this film. Unfortunately, I shot so much already, but we managed to, with everybody else's help, integrate her story into the film. So it's like a really an anchor, I think, for the whole project. Doreen hails from San Francisco. She was based in, as you have learned, she was based in Paris as a former New York Times journalist and author of The Forgetting River. The book explores her quest to recover her family's secret Jewish identity that led to 15th century ancestors investigated by the Spanish Inquisition for heresy. As a serious culture writer, Doreen remains active, developing new projects about the arts, and she's presently working on the return of stolen art from the Holocaust to descendants of their survivors, of the victims. Carlos de Medeiros. When I met Carlos actually at the American Sephardi Federation at the film festival there. He describes himself as a bad boy who became a seminarian for 17 years to make up to his very religious parents. His disenchantment with his spiritual quest led him deeper into the fine arts. Carlos is now a prolific artist based in Newark, New Jersey, and much of his art involves the theme of duality, including Catholic and Jewish iconography. And Carlos is also that's an extraordinary thing. He's the primary caretaker for an autistic child. He's done so for the past 15 years. Anna Guerra. Anna, are you there?
Right here.
All right. Okay. Anna is a psychotherapist in private practice in Houston, Texas. She lectures regularly at the Jung Center in Houston. She's a frequent lecturer and workshop presenter on topics related to psychological functioning, relationships, and the role of art and imagination in mental health. Anna is the 9th generation Laredoan, descended from the original founders of Laredo in 1755, and previously from the original colonists of Nuevo León in northern Mexico, known to have been established by the Portuguese converso, Luis de Carvajal. Anna became interested in the Sephardic history of northern Mexico and South Texas after hearing about her Jewish grandmother from Monterrey, whose family persisted in their Jewish identity, excuse me, and many Jewish rituals and customs, despite centuries of life in Catholic Mexico. Keith Stokes. Keith, are you there? Keith?
Hi, Joe.
There you are. Keith Stokes is presently vice president with the 1696 Heritage Group, a historical consulting firm dedicated to helping persons and institutions of color to increase their knowledge and access to their unique American heritage. The firm draws on extensive knowledge and experience in ethnic American historical research, interpretation, program, and product development. Keith has been a chairman of the Touro Synagogue Foundation, that's the first synagogue in the United States, vice president and trustee of the Preservation Society for Newport County and the Newport Historical Society, that's in Rhode Island, where I hail from also, and where oddly enough, David spent many years. Keith is a frequent national, state, and local lecturer in community and regional planning on historic preservation and interpretation with expertise in early African and Jewish American history. He's a regular television commentator on historical programs, and he recently traveled to Ghana, to Africa, to deliver a lecture as part of the 400th anniversary of the transatlantic slave trade. He and his wife are the recipients of the Rhode Island Council for the Humanities Prize for Creative Achievement in the Humanities. And last but not least, certainly, is Jason Guberman, who's executive. Jason, can you say hello?
Yes.
There you are.
Hi, Joe.
Hi, yeah. Thanks so much for being here. Jason is executive director of the American Sephardi Federation and a social entrepreneur who specializes in building broad coalitions and melding intellectual and technical innovation. As an example, Jason represented the American Sephardi Federation at the Muslim World League's National Conference on Peace, Harmony, and Coexistence in Sri Lanka, as well as on missions to Morocco, Egypt, Israel, Cyprus, the United Arab Emirates, and other countries. So I thank you all so much for attending. Most of us have been on panels together and have enjoyed talking to one another and talking with the audience, and I'm really looking forward to this. Let's start with something that comes across sometimes as controversial, and that is the topic of the Inquisition and the Holocaust, since the museum is a tribute to the Holocaust, or to the memory of the Holocaust. Ido Aharoni, who was the former ambassador to New York from Israel and a professor at NYU, has said that it's very difficult to understand the Holocaust unless you really understand the Spanish Inquisition. Some people think that means that there are parallels, and other people think that there are certain things in common and not in common. David, can you take you're the historian, main historian
Sure.
here. Can you talk about that?
Be pleased. Yeah, obviously both the Inquisition and the Holocaust are grounded in centuries and centuries of theologically grounded anti-Semitism that came out of the Christian world from Paul right up until modern times. But they were very, very different in their focus. the Spaniards were really trying to turn the Jews into good Christians in many ways. They sometimes converted by force, sometimes converted by persuasion. At the time of the expulsion, the Jews were given a choice to convert or to leave. The Inquisition, when it went after Judaizing converts, that is, people who continued to hold on to their Jewish thoughts and practices, they considered them bad Christians. And the Inquisition was a police force to try to correct their thought and behavior. They were trying to wipe Judaism out of Spain. The Nazis were trying to wipe Jews off the face of the earth. And that's a very different kind of focus.
Right. But David, let me ask you, there is the racism of Spanish Inquisition when you get to the blood libel laws. Can you talk about that and bring that into it, and maybe talk about how that plays out through the centuries?
That too has deep Christian theological roots, and it has to do with the sense of certain characteristics and predilections being passed down genetically, biologically. In the medieval anti-Semitic tropes, among them were the fact that Jews are by race, by inheritance, enjoined to do harm to Christians wherever they can. That led to things like the host desecration accusations and the crucifying Christian children and all of that kind of stuff. The inquisitors, in trying to track the networks of converts, believed that people who had recently converted from Judaism were likely to carry over into their new Christian life this kind of anti-Christian behavior, and they were acute to that. I have to say, on the other hand, many of the converts were accepted into the church with more or less open arms. At least 8 of them in the 15th century rose to the rank of bishop in Spain. So there was that side of it as well.
Actually, since you brought that up, I want to skip to a question I was going to ask later. And Carlos, I'd like you to chime in on this too, please. How much do you think that the awareness, or maybe the sub rosa awareness of one's Jewish background has led to the deep anti-Semitism that was experienced so much? And Anna, as a psychotherapist, maybe you could join in as well.
I'll jump in there, Joe. One of the things that we talk about in, you know, I'm a Jungian psychotherapist. We talk about this concept called the shadow, and it's about the repression of parts of ourselves. When we repress a part of ourselves because it's not favorable, or it could, you know, it impacts us socially, we can actually end up hating a part of ourselves. So there's that anti-Semitism against ourselves, but we can actually also compensate and try to prove that we are sincere Catholics, for example, and that could actually cause us to be even more harsh with our with other people that are like us. Mm-hmm. So that would be the psychological component.
Carlos, how did you see it exhibited in, if you saw it exhibited in your seminary and monastic studies?
I have no idea about my background until pretty much 15 years after from Me Too and talk about, but in the whole process from the very second day in a monastery, that speech from the priest was very telling. And I had no idea about my bloodline, and I was very bothered by how rushed and how dehumanized he was referring to Jews. And this was like during the mass on the sermon,
Carlos,
it's like
Carlos, you're breaking.
Can you hear me?
You're breaking up a good deal.
There is a lot of stuff coming through in my cell phone now, and I'm just ignore everything. But okay, hold on. Hear me? Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
The very first experience make me think of how not fair was. But I again, I just find out the whole process of defending Jews soon after the mass led me to be expelled from this first monastery, just because I asked the priest why you said those things about the Jews. And the follow-up of this whole thing was, in the next monastery wasn't different, and was a couple of years after, there was somebody coming to the church just to give a workshop, and was a woman. And I remember a room with 150 monks, and again, anti-Semitic stuff. I was pretty, I was shocked, because I just grew up with a family that we learned how to be in peace with everybody, okay? My mother became very religious after she left, stopped to drink, and the experience of religion became from that point. And for her to discover her roots as a Jewish person, I don't know, I feel like I'm getting lost here. I'm so sorry. But it exists, and it's palpable. You can choose to ignore. We can choose to defend. You can choose to try to dig why that happens. And full closure for me was actually discover that I had in my blood the lineage of Jewish culture somehow. Because again, my mother was doing kosher stuff, even being very, very Christian, very Catholic, but everything was pretty much on a kosher side of things. And some stuff, when I asked her, she was just said was bad luck to not do it. And
Right.
it's very strange for me that this at this day and age is still going on. We talk from a very specific historical aspect of 2,000 years of Christianity, and deep inside, underneath of the rug, this thing exists. And I still trying to understand why some people don't see the evil of ostracize somebody because they believe in something different. Mm-hmm. And anyway, this is pretty much something I can say.
Well, since you're leading into a question that I again had later, but since you're there, can you all talk about, especially Doreen and Keith, who haven't spoken yet, about that sense of otherness and how it relates to this Converso topic, but how it relates in general in the world, in your experience?
Should I? Okay, go ahead. Go ahead.
Sure.
Please go.
No,
ahead.
go ahead.
After you. No, after you.
Please, Doreen, go ahead.
Well, I think, like many people, I always felt this sense of otherness, even as a New York Times reporter, even when I was covering the book publishing industry in New York. I always felt like I didn't have a pedigree. I didn't feel like I quite fit in. And, you know, I don't know whether that was something I, you know, inherited as a defensive mechanism from the past, or whether that was just me. But when you talk about the sense of otherness, I think about a violinist that I interviewed in Mallorca a few years ago. He descended from the Chuetas. They were conversos going back to the 17th century. There were about 17 families that were persecuted. And that sense of otherness persisted into the 20th century and beyond. And at 78, he talked to me about how there was a nursery rhyme that they used to recite with the names of the Chueta families, so that this discrimination and persecution and marginalization passed from generation to generation. And I just might add that at 78, after many decades of reflection and study, he finally decided to formally convert, even though he had been raised a Catholic and he was a Chueta. But part of that otherness, as he put it, was there was fear. He always felt fear that he would be discovered.
And can you talk about your sense of otherness?
Joe, it's interesting. From my perspective, it's never been otherness. If anything, we've always had a strong sense and identity that we were not white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. We're quite proud, and most importantly, had family heirlooms and stories and documents that had a sense of pride of not being a part of what we saw was a WASP environment. In fact, I occupy a very interesting historical space within the Jewish diaspora because it's also tied to the African diaspora, and both took place almost concurrently with the settlement of what would be called the New World. In fact, many of the earliest Jewish settlements in the New World were also locations where enslaved Africans would land. And in my personal family case, I have a maternal grandmother who descended from the earliest Jewish settlers across the diaspora. And then I have a maternal grandfather, her husband, who descended directly from enslaved Africans originating from what is today the Fanti people in Ghana. So, and even having both sets of ancestors at one point coexisting in 18th century Jamaica. So from my perspective, I've always been aware of my Jewishness, not as a heritage or a cultural connection, more of a heritage and cultural connection, less as a religious one. But I think while I'm not observant, I also recognize, and I've been taught and I've learned that I exist today, our family exists today by the very actions taken by our Jewish and African ancestors who were able to survive and thrive despite the most difficult times in the history for both those groups. So for me, it's just been an absolute joy that the rest of the country and world have caught up to what I've always known, you know, our strong sense and pride of our Jewish origins and our strong sense of pride of our African origins.
Great. And has your at least dual background, has that, how has it been met in the different communities in which you've traveled and lived?
Well, from my perspective, I've had the opportunity to travel across the world, from again, Africa to Israel to the West Indies. And for the most part, I've been participating in cultural and heritage programs where there's been an audience that has an interest in this history, this shared history, world history, religious history. But for the most part, I'm blessed. I mean, I've had the opportunity to have family members and heirlooms that date back to over 3 centuries. And I just see this as an opportunity to awaken the public so that they can begin to trace their ancestry and more importantly, rediscover their shared heritage. And my kids are 9th generation Newporters, so we've been tied to Newport since the very early days of Jewish settlement and African enslavement. And I'm just very proud to be able to present that story and history to the people today. Great,
thank you. You use the term Jewishness that we hear more and more, especially in academic discussions and about, because there's so much more intermarriage and certainly, you know, way more intermingling of people of different backgrounds. So that a lot of people have who may not be religiously Jewish and may not even be identified as Jewish, but they have a sense of Jewishness because of the families that they come from or the neighborhoods they live in, et cetera, et cetera. I can toss this out to anybody. What do you think about the term Jewishness, and what does it mean?
I'll say a thing or two.
Sure.
Those conversations on this topic always get murky after about the second sentence. And one of them is because people are coming from different places and they define Jewishness and, for that matter, Judaism very differently. For some people, it's the practice of religious customs. For others, it's adherence to a certain set of beliefs, whether or not they practice any customs at all. For some, it has a biological component, being members of a tribe A Jew is someone who has two, a string of Jewish grandmothers. For some, it's none of those things. It's just a sense of personal identity that they're Jewish. And then, of course, there's always the other with the external definition, not I'm a Jew because I think I am, but rather you are a Jew because I say so. That's when the defining goes into the hands of the Nazis or into the hands of the Inquisitors. That's when then people run into trouble. But the conversations very often go like this. They don't meet because people are bringing different concepts of what Jewishness is to the conversation.
Yeah, it's interesting. Anna, do you want to tackle that?
Yeah, I'll say something about that. I grew up in a very Catholic environment. I actually went to a Catholic school and was baptized, first communion, and yet there was always a part of me that, and maybe I'm addressing something a little different, but I always felt Jewish-y, which was kind of interesting. And
Jewish-ish.
Jewish-ish. Yeah, and whenever I met people that were identified as Jewish, I was always very curious and very interested and felt this enormous resonance. So I gravitated towards Judaism, but I always wanted to feel legitimate and in. So I think that led me to actually convert and to learn Hebrew and be part. I had a B'nai Mitzvah. I'm actually getting ready to lead a service for the first time this coming month. So I've gotten very involved in the religious aspect. And that was very important for me to feel like I could legitimately say I was Jewish, but really important, right?
And so the ritual, the religiosity is very important to you for your Jewish identity.
The religiosity, but it's not just the religiosity. There's a different mindset. I find a different mindset among the people that are part of the synagogue. It's a conservative synagogue, but I think it's on the liberal side. But I also tend to identify with a certain kind of mindset and a certain freedom of thought that I identify as Jewish. So maybe that's one of the things that I also gravitated towards.
Yeah. Jason, you're executive director of the American Sephardi Federation. Can you talk about how attitudes toward the Anusim and people wanting to return, or people who are just interested in their background, how that has changed perhaps within the Sephardic community over the years and where it is today?
Thank you, Joe. So I think it's critical on a day like today on Tisha B'Av, when the central lesson is the baseless hatred and how divisions of the Jewish people led to our ultimate destruction and exile, that we tread very carefully when we're talking about the crypto-Jewish experience and how crypto-Jews have been persecuted, of course, by outsiders, by inquisitors, by many others who have unfortunately followed in the examples of the inquisitors, but also from our own people, and how we as our own people need to do teshuvah for what has happened to the crypto Jews. I'll cite as
Jason, may I interrupt you for just a second? For those who don't know, today is, excuse me, Carlos, a little noisy. Today is the holiday that Jason is referring to is Tisha B'Av, commemorates the loss of the first and second temples, and has recently come to commemorate the expulsion from Spain. So it's a day of mourning, it's a day of fasting, and it's also the day before Columbus set sail for America. And as we say in the film, he set sail when the harbors were filled with fleeing Jews. I just want to make that clear for people who didn't know. Okay, Jason, go ahead.
Sure. So to give an example from history, there were waves of forcible conversion, as we know, to Christianity as well as to Islam. And one of the forcible converts to Islam wrote to a rabbi and asked for guidance on whether he should observe as many mitzvot, as many commandments as possible, even though he had forcibly been converted to another religion. Could he still do good deeds as a Jew and get credit as a Jew? And the rabbi condemned him and said, no, you will not receive any credit. Every mitzvah you do will be a sin against you, and moreover, you can never convert back to Judaism. So Rambam, Maimonides, in a famous response to this, completely refuted what this rabbi had said, and said, no, it's for a convert to continue to observe any mitzvah, it's actually an added blessing, because they're doing so at great personal peril. And so many, while we still have skeptics and even opponents within the Jewish community who question the veracity of historical claims or genealogical claims or the sincerity of converts, thankfully, more and more people are adopting the Maimonidean mindset and looking at the tremendous accomplishment that being a crypto Jew is. That the generations have been able to maintain any connection is absolutely fascinating. And we at the American Sephardi Federation are very proud to highlight these examples. We do an exhibit every year called Nosotros, along with the Philos Project, that celebrates the Latino community and the Jewish community coming together. Some of the artists who participate have crypto roots. They know about it. Others, suspect that they have roots, but in any case, want to have a good relationship with the Jewish community. And the people who have come to these events have been completely amazing. There was one man who came who said, I always felt a connection to the Jewish people, but there was a list of names published in the Brazilian newspaper and my name was on it. And unfortunately, I'm already married. My husband is Ashkenazi, but I feel very Sephardi, and I'm very proud to be Sephardi. And he's come back. He's taken a Ladino class now, and this has continued to develop. And we should nurture this, and we should be supportive of it.
Fascinating, really, really fascinating. That's it. Really, one of the things that brings up is I always think about Fiddler on the Roofs when I hear about people with conversion and all. And here Tevye is this, rather extraordinary man in his ordinariness. And he had children who were going against tradition. And the first one marries without his permission. The second one does as well. And the third one, and he embraces them both. But the third one marries a Gentile, and he cannot embrace her. And this goes so deeply in Jewish culture, and it goes back so far. And I often wonder, David, you and I have spoken about this a bit, as I mused, is it possible that that the rejection of the convert by the Jewish people made things even worse in terms of their relationships with their now Catholic cousins? And it's just always sort of fascinated me how much our own tradition of shunning the convert might have really made things much, much worse for the history of the Jewish people. I just wonder if anybody has any thoughts on that.
The historical record is mixed. As in most things. For almost every convert in Spain in the 15th century had Jewish relatives as well as Christian relatives. And every single one of them was faced with the issue of how to deal with family celebrations. What do you do with a wedding? What do you do with a funeral? What do you do with a bris and things of that sort?
Right.
And the examples of how the families dealt with that runs the whole gamut, from strict separation to continued close integration.
Even then.
Even then, Doreen's umpteen great grandparents, you know, this guy was converted as a child, Diego Arias. He became the chancellor of the exchequer. He donated a chapel to a church, and he smuggled his still Jewish sister into the next door house, and they used to get together through a secret door in the garden and celebrate together. He would drop in at the synagogue on his way to church. He would stand up on a bench and put a tablecloth over his head and sing piyut, and then go do a Hail Mary at the church. I mean, his family on both sides were very accepting of him. That was in that generation. After 1480 or so, it became much harder in Spain. But the reactions outside of Spain were the same way. There were rabbis who, you know, someone would come from Spain and they said, "You're a hero and we admire what you've done, but of course you can't eat at my house. You can't marry my daughter because you don't do this or you don't do that." There were others who took exactly the opposite kind of tack. So the wrestling with this issue, not a surprise, is a Jewish tradition.
Doreen, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, David brings up my my ancestors, and I'm thinking of another anecdote involving them where they tried to find a way to mix both things, even at the end of their lives. For example, they should have, my great-grandfather and some of the other relatives should have been buried in the earth near Segovia. They couldn't do that because they had converted, but he also wanted to have really grand tombs because, as David pointed out, he had a prominent position and he was quite wealthy. And so people come up with compromises to maintain their faith and tradition. And we see this over and over. And in this case, the Inquisition records and testimonies indicate that they put dirt from the earth in Segovia and a little below the pillow of my, great grandmother 15 times removed as a symbolic way of connecting them to the earth. So a lot of people found ways to compromise and to maintain these dual lives. And it actually in some ways made them more creative. Velasquez, the painter, is another example. He had Jewish roots, which he tried to cover up. But having this dual identity, making these compromises, made people more creative. So in some ways, we got something from it.
Yeah, they were made up of more.
One of the things that makes Doreen's family so interesting is that they were an example of the tensions and of the mixing in so many ways. Diego had 3 children, one of whom became a soldier, was killed fighting for Isabel in the civil wars of Castile. His son was also a soldier, became the go-to person for problems when Ferdinand and Isabel had problems. And he was the guy who came to Central America and cut Balboa's head off when Balboa was rebelling against the king and queen. And he became the first colonial governor of Nicaragua, the grandson of this man. The second son, he put in the church, and he arose to become Bishop of Segovia and turned out to be one of the most liberal Renaissance bishops in all of Christian Spain. The third child, a daughter, married a very religious convert who was a merchant. They have a beautiful mansion in Segovia, but continued to practice Judaism right up to the end. The son who became bishop celebrated, observed Yom Kippur with his family the year before he became bishop. But then after he became bishop, there isn't a single recorded instance of any kind of Judaizing behavior in this man. He became a 100% Catholic bishop. So go figure. in the one family, you really have the whole gamut of reactions to the converso experience.
Right. Yeah, it's a fascinating family. I was so privileged to be with David and Doreen in the archives in Madrid, going through the testimonies against the family. I mean, it was a magical experience that we hope we captured in the film. I'd like to turn this a little bit to the topic of intergenerational trauma, which has been a hot topic for a long time. And we showed clips from the film to a narrative medicine group that was doing discussing intergenerational trauma at Columbia University's medical school. Whoops, am I there? Yeah. And at the end we just showed a short section, maybe about 30 minutes of the film. And one of the people in attendance, these were all children, all of these academics were children of Holocaust survivors. And one of them said, well, of course, the trauma of the people in your film isn't coming from the Inquisition. It's from the discovering that they have Jewish roots. And then someone else said, well, why are you saying that? When does intergenerational trauma stop? You know, does it stop with your children? Does it stop with your grandchildren? How is this exhibited, you know, through the generations? And what is it really all about? And there's more and more study being done about it. And I was wondering if Anna, if you could talk about it professionally, and if everybody else could maybe chime in personally, because honestly, when I started this project, and people would tell me about their feelings of Jewishy, as you say, Anna, or wondering about this, and sort of some people talk about mystical experience, I would say, oh yeah, come on. But as I've heard more and more about it and looked at some of the scientific studies about intergenerational trauma, I give it much more credence. I'm just curious what you guys think about it. So Anna, if you could start.
Yeah, you know, I think I would start with the idea that the children of the Inquisition, the people that have these Jewish roots, are not a homogeneous group. And so, I mean, if I were to work with anyone with these Jewish groups, I would want to know what the specific locale, what their specific experience was. And then I could certainly think about some people might have or experience a traumatic experience on discovering their roots, but that wouldn't be the general case. It wouldn't be everyone. There are people certainly who've discovered this history and who have not been traumatized. And I think that there's other ways that these groups have been impacted as well. When I look at the specific group that I come from, the ones in northern Mexico, I think of more of the experience of repression and the impact of repression. The experience of in Spain and over several centuries was about repression of Jewish culture, the Jewish religion, and it's not something that ended in one epoch and one period. It's something that reverberated. And you know, even the way you described, Joe, how you came to discover and be interested in this phenomenon also goes to this experience of repression. When your rabbi was talking to this group of descendants and everyone was saying, we're all Catholic, that in itself was a present day experience of repression, and you could feel the anxiety. People were not going to talk about this. So if you have the experience of people not wanting to talk about a history, and yet that history continuing to be talked about in implicit ways, then you're talking about an ongoing kind of repression. And I think that's what's happening with some people that feel a lot of energy in expressing it and wanting to live into it. There's always people in the group that are more sensitive, that are more interested in bringing things out into the open, and are kind of like the leaders in a way. So I think that's one way that this gets expressed. So I don't think about an event that happened before and that's been reverberating in genetics, but something that's systemic and that people grew up in.
Anyone else like to talk about that?
I think I like to say something. Oh, very quick. This is very quick. It's the whole thing about my trauma is bigger than yours. My repression is bigger than yours. But when I start to share, even before I came across to you, Joe, I remember that I went to rent something for a wedding, and the owner of the place was this Ashkenazi guy. I said, "Oh yeah, I have a perfect fit for you." That's not the story. But the guy looked at me and my partner, now my husband, said, "Oh, he just found out he's Jewish." And this guy that owned this business that I was going to, pay for his service, he looked at me and he said, you don't look Jewish at all. And I said, okay, this is another thing about the Jewishness of looking Jewish or not. But the fact that my family come from, my both parents, mother and father, they come from this area in Brazil of 380 years of people living in close corners, right? Communities. I find out 10 years ago that my great-grandfather actually found a city, a whole city. He found a city. It's a big city now, but when he started, the city was a small city. So this area, everybody is Jewish, 100%, but for 380 years, generations and generations of people in this countryside of Brazil, they repress the fact that they're Jewish. And they're acting Catholic, everything Catholic, but with every kosher tradition that you could possibly imagine. From the way they kill they slaughter the chickens and the animals and so on and so forth, to habits of how they clean their houses. So when somebody, even my mother, when she comes to me and she tells me, actually, I ask her, I'd like to know more about this thing that you told me about the Jewish of descendant. And then for 4 years, she said to me, why you want to know more about that thing? She used the word thing to not even use the word, being Jewish. When I came from Brazil 3 months ago, and you spoke about this again, she asked me, are you still looking for those things that I told you? And I think it was hysterical, because how many years ago we are in a journey, okay? Not because you're 100% Jewish, because you have a bar mitzvah and this and so on and so forth. I'm not diminishing nothing here. I'm just reclaiming my tradition. I don't even know if I can say that I'm a believer, because the Jewishness or the Jewish-ish on me is just part of this string of bloody line that goes from my mother all the way to Branca Diaz, even before. Anyway.
Great. Keith?
Well, Joe, I just wanted to add that from my own personal family experience, it's never been about intergenerational trauma, but it's intergenerational pride. I mean, I've always been aware of my Jewishness, as it's called today. It's more of a heritage and cultural consideration than a religious one, but it's important that I've always recognized that my Jewish ancestral connections were always a strong part of my, personal family history identity. It's a part of my DNA to this very day. And I had the advantage of growing up knowing this history and heritage. We knew, and then we were able to document our Jewish ancestries tracing back to 15th century Spain, to Galicia, to a small town called Toro. So we had those connections, then on to Portugal, then on to Jamaica and Barbados, and then eventually New York and Newport. So we had those documents, we had that heritage, and most importantly, we had those stories that were being passed on through each generation. And in each and every case, these were not stories of historical ghosts of the past. They were not stories based upon the institution or the perpetrators. It was about our creative survival. Our ancestors were always flesh and blood human beings who survived and prospered despite the Inquisition, despite racial, religious discrimination. And in fact, the story of my ancestors here in colonial Newport and even Civil War era Virginia, the issue was never integration. We never sought integration. We simply sought and were satisfied with interdependence. We knew who we were. We knew how we would worship God. We would contribute to the larger community of society, but we weren't looking to integrate with the larger community of society. We would produce, we'd be productive citizens, but we simply wanted to be independent, dependent upon our choice in how we marry, our choice in what we eat, and our choice of how we worship our God. And for that least small group of people that are associated with my family, it worked over the past 300 years.
Joe, can I add a point?
Yeah, sure, please.
And you mentioned that some of the people watching the film, someone said, was it the trauma of discovering Jewish roots?
Mm-hmm.
For me, that's not trauma at all. The trauma is knowing that something was stolen from my family, from generations, and that's identity. And you think you know who you are, and you don't know who you are. And the word Israel means to struggle with God wrestling. And that's what I feel that I'm doing now, and maybe others like me as well. So wrestling with identity, finding our way. I feel like in my case, I am drawn to the Jewish community because of its resilience. It's survived the Inquisition, pogroms, massacres, the Holocaust. And Jewish philosophy teaches that in this adversity, it's not about overcoming. It's about challenging this adversity and learning to cope with it. And in my own case, it wasn't traumatic to know this. It actually benefited me when, in my case, a couple of years ago, I had a rare form of cancer. And in my worst moments, I thought about my ancestors and what they had been through. And what I was going through was nothing compared to them. So their triumphs, their downfalls, they all kind of they were at my back. They helped me along the way. So I do not feel in any way it's traumatic to discover Jewish roots.
You know, I'd like to open this up to the audience, but there's one thing I think that we should talk about, which was a shock to me. David, you said to me during our time together with Doreen in Spain, you said, do you know how many people were actually killed by the Inquisition for Judaizing? And I said no, and you said, take a guess. And the number I picked was very, very, very large. And you smiled and you said knowingly 3,000. And over 350 years, which absolutely shocked me. But I think it, looking at what's going on in the world today, I think it shows how the government can impose trauma on a civilization to using just examples of not all that many people, that it can have a profound effect. And can you just talk about that in terms of that history?
Well, again, this is replaying bits of conversations that we've had. One of the things that the Inquisition was supremely skilled at was imparting a sense of fear, generally, much greater than, in many cases, its actual actions were. And it was that fear, much as in any autocratic, dictatorial state with an intrusive police force, whether it's the Stasi in East Germany or any other, is a controlling mechanism. And it very, very much shaped the evolution of Hispanic culture really ever since. And that's a discussion for another whole day. But it cast a very, very, very long shadow, the Inquisition did. And it's a shadow that persists until today.
Yeah, and it's interesting because you see it being played out in other regimes, and it seems to work. Samantha, do you want to? I'm sorry, Jason. You want to comment on that?
If I could just add, I mean, we've
Sure.
been in touch with one descendant of crypto Jews who was telling us about his grandfather, who had been a major political figure in the U.S. And into the 1960s, he said his grandfather was still afraid of the long reach of the Inquisition. And similarly from other, we have a course, part of the ASF Institute experience on the crypto experience. And similarly, it took a lot of time for the Mashadi Iranian community to come out of their shell after it was okay to come back to Judaism.
Yeah, it's amazing how long this lasts. And so, you know, I think intergenerational trauma is a reality if it's whether it's DNA or an ongoing memory that's passed on.
Joe, can I add just one point with that?
Yeah.
Just because, I mean, my maternal grandmother, who converted in 1903, but she never used the terms Sephardic or Grandees or anything like that. Hers was always a descendant of the Spanish Jews. And she saw herself and her sisters and her parents and her family members as a part of a very special elite group of Jews who had arrived to the New World. They were merchant traders. They were leaders of commerce and culture. She and her sisters were college educated. And she would remind me as a very young boy of that very special inheritance. But she would also state that it was different from what many people during her early days saw Jewish people. And in fact, for her, growing up largely in Newport, but in Harlem, when Harlem was largely a Jewish community in the 1890s, she would tell me stories of taking carriage rides to the Lower East Side and interacting with Jewish people who spoke differently from her, worshiped differently from her, and it was a different circumstance. So she would explain to me that for her, what she saw and always believed her Jewishness was tied to her Spanish origins, which gave her, you know, the right to be able to have this, you know, very positive American experience in life. So I think that's important to understand that there's this intersection of class, religious orientation, that layers itself on old-fashioned discrimination, Christian discrimination and bigotry. And it makes it a very complex existence for all of us.
Yeah, I know, and it's interesting. I was brought up in a very WASP-dominant society in Providence, Rhode Island, and friends' fathers would say to me, and I used to take this as a compliment, you know, Joey, there are Jews and there are kikes, and I can't stand kikes, but there's nothing wrong with nice Jewish people like your family. And it really wasn't until the civil rights movement that I understood what he was saying. And he was, I mean, it wasn't just one person. And I remember saying around 1959 to a friend's father, listen, Mr. So-and-so, you know, I'm every bit as much of a kike as any Jew you'll ever meet. And it was, and I felt this incredible sense of shame for having accepted this as a compliment. It was really fascinating, really fascinating. But Samantha, do you want to open it up to other questions?
Absolutely. So I have a bunch of questions here. Please keep the questions coming. We have about 15 minutes, so we'll try to get to as many as we can. This first question comes from Anthony. Anthony watched the film, and he wants to know, at the end of the film, you sort of tease us with a few moments with the chief of the Lacan. Can you talk about some of their journey to Judaism?
Yeah, well, I don't know an awful lot about it, but Antonio Chavez, I met at a conference of the Crypto-Judaic Studies Conference, which is a wonderful organization, the Society for Crypto-Judaic Studies. And they have a conference every other year at least. And what happened was that his family had left Spain and then had come back and then gone to Peru. And in Peru, there had been an edict that was coming out, and they found out that they were going to be attacked. And they got on a boat and they headed to El Salvador, which is now El Salvador. And they were met by the Lenca Indians, and the Lencas said, "Are you Castellanos? Are you Spanish?" And they said, "No, we're conversos." And they, understanding that they weren't true Catholics, they were taken in and intermarried. And Antonio is very active in the rights of indigenous people around the country, around the world. And it's a it's a fascinating story, and we put that on. It didn't fit into the film, and it was just a moment. He was this wonderful guy that I met at a conference, but I thought it was so fascinating. I thought it was important to let people see that this doesn't end. I mean, the effects of the Inquisition, it had so much influence throughout the entire world.
Thank you, Joe. We have a question here for Anna, actually. This question comes from May. May asks, Anna, my ancestors were with Carvajal. My Moreno line is also from Laredo, many generations, and my ancestor was Balthazar de Sosa, who was with Carvajal in Monterrey. Did you begin your studies into your heritage, and where did you start reconnecting to your heritage? Did you apply for Portuguese citizenship? And if so, what was that process like?
I started because I learned about a grandmother from Monterrey who practiced a lot of the Jewish rituals, and she came to live in Laredo, and that's how I discovered that whole community. But if she's related to Baltasar de Sosa, she's probably also related to a lot of the original colonists there in Monterrey, because they all intermarried, and there's a lot of genealogy being done. So one of the ways of finding that information is to hook into some of the groups. There's a couple of groups in the area. One of them is called We Are Cousins, because literally we are cousins. And you can get just extensive genealogical information, and then start hooking into the bibliographies to get the specific information about what was going on, and the bits that still that we know about that she can connect to. And also I want to say that in Monterrey, it's been announced there will be a museum to Sephardic history, and the woman who is created that also does a lot of genealogy. It's called Centro Separad Carvajal, so it's got the Carvajal name. You can get a lot more genealogy that way, and so that's one way to do some research. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Anne. Another question for Joe. Joe, this question comes from Matt. He wants to thank you for the wonderful film, and he says that it seems like this was a very personal journey for you. At any point in the process, did you have a realization about how much of your heritage might perhaps be Spanish? And if so, by extension, how much of the Spanish experience remains as an undercurrent in the tribe in total?
Well, I've always been fascinated by the Sephardic experience ever since my rabbi gave this sermon. But I never thought there was any reason for me to think that I had, any Sephardic background, although I thought it would be very glamorous to have it. And so what I did a DNA test 10 years ago, which keeps getting, the family tree DNA, which keeps getting updated as the database gets bigger. And just a few months ago, a whole new line popped up that says that I'm like 4%. 4% of my DNA is from Sardinia through Greece. And a noted genealogist that I know said, well, this would certainly indicate that you have Sephardic background. And at the same time, it showed that I had Iranian background as well, which was quite a shock. And then I discovered, maybe it was Jason who said it, that a number of people from the Inquisition had found their way to Iran. And so maybe there is some calling there. I don't know. I've just always found it fascinating, really fascinating. And my brother-in-law, after my sister died, married one of her best friends who was Sephardic, and she and her mother would always regale me with stories of their family, because they did trace their family all the way back to the 1500s, and I just was always fascinated by this culture.
It is very fascinating, and your interest and passion for the subject definitely comes through in the film itself. A few more questions here. Jerry points out that in the movie, you mentioned that Marrano means swine, and he's read that it could refer to the fact that secretly Jews ate pork on purpose in public. Do you know which interpretation is more frequently cited? That's sort of a more academic question. Anyone can answer.
That's a David Gitlitz question, I think.
There's lots of examples of throughout the Inquisition testimony of Judaizing conversos adopting publicly customs that they thought would proclaim that they were good, solid Christians. And eating pork in public was one of them. Or if not eating pork in public, at least waving it around. And so there's a good deal of that, many documented cases. The actual association of Marrano with crypto-Jews, curiously enough, does not happen in Spain, but in Italy. And then spreads through much of Southern Europe from there. So there were lots of pejorative terms for converts and bad converts as early as the 15th century, but Marrano was a fairly late import into Spain.
Just to add as a side note, the Chuetas in Mallorca, the descendants of conversos, Chueta means pork chop. So the image keeps returning.
What I found fascinating, David, was when you told me that the idiom colgar el San Benito, which means to wear the San Benito, is to defame somebody. I thought
to
that
publicly
was really
defame somebody, yeah.
and it's still an idiom today. Is that correct?
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah. Well, those things, they spread into the culture, you know. Like it's colbacete, it becomes copacetic.
Great, thank you so much. Question from Henry. Are there any studies that would estimate the number of South Americans with Jewish bloodlines?
I have some, I think that's, statistics are very up in the air, and people tend to, if they go there, tend to disagree. But people have said that as much as 25%, and some people say higher, of Latin Americans carry Jewish DNA. I don't know, but I'm repeating what I've been told. David, I think you have different thoughts on that?
There are lots and lots of studies. I don't think there are any credible ones.
Because of the cohorts? The cohorts are too small, or?
Because they are not careful about their definitions to start with. So getting back to the talking in different fashions.
Yeah.
We have pretty good data about the percentage of people of converso background who came into colonial Mexico and into colonial Brazil, based largely on genealogies constructed through Inquisition stuff. And it was much higher in Brazil for a number of reasons. One of them was that in the earliest days, Brazil, the Portuguese government used Brazil as a kind of a penal colony, sent people who were convicted of being, Judaizing conversos, sentenced them to go to Brazil. So there was some of that going on.
Oh, wow.
Maybe as many as a quarter of the people in 16th century Brazil were converso descendants.
Wow.
And then, and then the intermarriage. If you look at it, if you go back 16 generations, we have 2 grandparents, 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents, and so forth. Doesn't take you very far to go back to have an extraordinary number of people of direct ancestors who were alive in the year 1500. We're talking about each of us, each of you on the screen has many tens of thousands of ancestors who were alive in the year 1500. The chances of none of them having been Jewish are infinitesimally small. So if an Spaniard comes up to you and says, I think I have a Jewish ancestor, you say, duh. You know the technical term for the descendants of conversos in Spain today? Spaniards.
We have time for just one more question. And this one is kind of more open-ended, I guess, so I'll throw it out there to whoever wants to answer. It comes from Catalin. She asks, is there now any regret for conversos who have finally come out as Jews because of the rise of anti-Semitism?
Good question.
I don't feel any regret. Actually, I'm really enjoying my community. It's a community that's been very open and integrating and works very hard to integrate people. It also works very hard at having people participate actively. So I feel very very connected, more connected than I felt before. So it's just a lovely spiritual community.
Just to add, I don't feel any regret myself, but since I live in the Paris area, I constantly confront the history of World War II. So I see what happened to people who tried to hide their Jewish background when anti-Semitism was rising, Jews who converted to Christianity to save themselves, sent their children off to stay with nuns. I don't feel obviously that we face that kind of situation right now, but I look back at the choices that people made back then when they tried to save themselves, and I'm sympathetic to them.
And I just want to add that being associated with Turl Synagogue and Turl Synagogue Foundation here in Newport, Rhode Island, our task is to regale the story from the Inquisition to the early settlement, and most importantly, the stories of obtaining religious freedom, civil liberties, civil rights. I can't think of topics that are more relevant today than those three topics. And we look forward to further sharing these important stories that will benefit all people of all races and ethnicities and religions across the world.
Great. Well, wonderful. I unfortunately have to wrap up today's program. That's all the time that we have for today. But I want to thank once again Joe and all of our panelists, and also the American Sephardi Federation and Jason for your help putting this wonderful program together, and for also allowing us to stream the film. We're getting a lot of questions, Joe. Where can people purchase the film or watch it? I know things are kind of up in the air right now with coronavirus, right. But maybe you can let people know if
sure.
they watch it again.
Sure, just very briefly. How much longer is it on, or is it up on your website?
It's going to be up on Vimeo until tomorrow morning, 10 a.m. Eastern.
Okay. All right, so you have until then. What we've chosen to do, we want these intense discussions. And so I want people to watch it together if they can, or at least discuss it together. So we've chosen not to make it available to individuals yet, but it is available through your, any organization you might have, an educational institution, a religious house of worship, a community organization, and it's $1,000 a screening. And what we've been doing is having, we open up our link and people can watch it, and then we have a Zoom talkback, just as we've just done with Samantha. And we found out it's been much more successful than live screenings. We have people watching from all over the world, and it's on Dutch television right now. We don't have an American broadcaster yet, and but we're looking for international broadcasts. Yes,
Joe,
Charlie.
Gonna be in Disney Plus?
I don't know. I don't know. But for now, we really want it as a discussion tool, because I think the film is a good film and an important film, but I think the issues that it raises is most important.
Absolutely. And for those of you asking, I will resend the link to the Vimeo where you can stream the film until tomorrow at 10. I'll send it out in my follow-up email later today. Hopefully, I'll try to get to it as soon as possible. Yep.
Oh, excuse me, Samantha. And if people want to contact us, they can go to info@childrenoftheinquisition.com.
Yep. And also, if you're watching this program now, chances are that you registered and received a confirmation email. That email also contains the link to screen the film. So one way or another, you should be able to find the link by either contacting one of us or looking in your email. But I will follow up with all of today's registrants with an email containing a link to the film for screening and also to the YouTube video of this program. Today's program was recorded, so no worries if your friends missed out. We will upload it to YouTube for posterity.
Great.
Well, fabulous. I want to thank once again all of our esteemed speakers. It was a pleasure connecting with all of you from around the world. And thank you, Joe and Jason, for this opportunity.
Sure. Thank you, Samantha. Great.